There is a place in the galaxy where no ship goes willingly. It sits between two dying stars, in a stretch of nothing so deep that even light seems tired by the time it passes through. The navigation charts of 100 species mark it in red, some mark it in black, a few have erased it from their maps entirely, as if forgetting the place might undo what happened there. But if you drift close enough, if your senses are sharp enough and your courage holds, you will find something, a small object, no bigger than a clenched fist. It tumbles slowly through the dark, broadcasting a signal on every known frequency and several that are not known at all. The signal is not a word. It is not a warning. It is not a cry for help. It is simply a sound. A single human heartbeat, recorded and looping, steady and calm, playing over and over into the emptiness. No one knows how long it has been there. No one has ever tried to retrieve it. And if you ask the old traders, the ones who have been flying these routes since before the wars, they will tell you a name. They will say it quietly, because even after all this time, saying it loudly still feels dangerous. They will say her name was Marin Okoro, and then they will change the subject, because the story of how that beacon came to be is not the kind of story anyone tells comfortably. This is that story. The ship was called the Drifter. It was not a beautiful ship. It was not fast or powerful or impressive in any way that would make a shipyard proud. It was a cargo hauler, built 60 years before Marin was born, patched and repaired so many times that almost nothing original remained. The hull was scarred. The engine coughed when it started. The heating system worked only on the left side of the vessel, which meant Marin slept in 3 blankets and kept her coffee close. But the Drifter was hers. She had bought it with 7 years of wages earned on mining stations across the outer belt. She had rebuilt its navigation computer with her own hands, using parts she traded for and parts she simply found. She had painted her name on the side in white letters that were already beginning to fade, and she loved it the way a person loves something they have earned through suffering. Marin was 34 years old. She was not tall. She was not strong in the way soldiers are strong. She had brown skin and dark eyes and short hair that she cut herself with a knife because she had never owned scissors that worked in low gravity. She had a scar on her left forearm from a plasma leak she had sealed with her bare hand because there had been no time to find gloves. She had another scar on her neck, thin and white, from a time she did not talk about. She was a trader, a small one. She moved supplies between the outer colonies. Water purification tablets, seed stock, replacement parts for atmosphere generators, the kind of cargo that kept people alive but did not make anyone rich. She had been doing this work for 9 years, and in that time she had learned every back route, every hidden fuel depot, every quiet corridor of space where a small ship could pass without being noticed. This knowledge would soon save her life, and then it would make her the most wanted being in the galaxy. It began as most terrible things begin, with something ordinary. Marin had docked at Relay Station 14, a small trading post on the edge of Kothari space. The Kothari were an old species, insectoid with hard shells the color of wet stone and compound eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not imagine. They were not hostile to humans. They were not friendly either. They simply existed alongside humanity the way two strangers might share a waiting room with polite indifference. Relay 14 was a meeting point. Traders from a dozen species came and went. Marin had been there many times before. She knew the docking master, a tired Kothari named Selek, who always complained about the smell of human food, but secretly enjoyed the dried fruit Marin brought him. She knew the fuel prices and the best time to fill her tanks. She knew which vendors were honest and which would sell you water with rust in it. She had come to pick up a shipment of medical supplies bound for a human colony called New Thessaly, 3 weeks away at the Drifter's best speed. The shipment was late. The supplier, a Venari merchant named Ooze, had sent a message saying the cargo would arrive in 2 days, so Marin waited. On the first day of waiting, she noticed the ship. It was docked on the far side of the station, in a berth usually reserved for diplomatic vessels. It was large, sleek, and painted in the deep blue of the Araith Concord. Marin knew the Araith. Everyone who traveled in this part of space knew the Araith. They were tall, thin beings with pale skin stretched over angular bones and eyes like polished silver. They moved with a grace that made other species feel clumsy. They spoke with voices that sounded like music played slightly too slow. and they believed with absolute certainty that they were the most important species in the galaxy. The Wraith Concord was not an empire in the traditional sense. They did not conquer through military force, at least not often. They conquered through influence, through trade agreements that always favored them, through cultural pressure that made other species feel small. They had a seat on every major council. They had observers in every neutral zone. They had intelligence networks that stretched into places most governments pretended did not exist. And they had a particular interest in humans. Marin did not know the full history. Few humans did. But she knew enough. She knew that when humanity had first made contact with the wider galaxy, the Erereth had been the ones to greet them. They had been welcoming, generous even. They had offered technology, trade routes, access to markets that would have taken humanity centuries to reach on its own. And humanity, young and eager, had accepted. It took 50 years for humans to realize what had happened. The trade agreements were traps. The technology was designed to create dependence. The market access came with conditions that slowly stripped human colonies of their autonomy. By the time humanity understood the game, the Araeth had positioned themselves as the gatekeepers of human expansion. Every new colony needed Ereth approval. Every trade route passed through Ereth checkpoints. Every human government owed something to the Concord. Some humans accepted this. They called it partnership. They called it the cost of joining the galactic community. But others remembered a word from old Earth, a word that had been used to describe similar arrangements throughout human history. The word was colonialism, and they were not willing to accept it again. Marin was one of these people, not in any dramatic way. She was not a rebel. She was not a fighter. She simply refused to use Ereth trade routes. She refused to register her cargo with Ereth checkpoints. She flew the back routes, the forgotten paths between stars, and she traded directly with the colonies that needed her goods. This was not illegal exactly, but it was inconvenient for the Concord, and the Wraith did not like inconvenience. She looked at the blue ship docked across the station and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She told herself it was nothing. Error 8 ships passed through Relay 14 all the time. There was no reason to think this one had anything to do with her. She was wrong. On the second day, the medical supplies arrived. Marin spent the morning loading them into the drifter's cargo hold, checking each container against her manifest, making sure nothing was damaged. It was careful, boring work, and she was halfway through it when Selleck, the docking master, appeared at her cargo bay door. He looked nervous. His compound eyes were shifting rapidly, which was the coffery equivalent of a person who could not stop looking over their shoulder. Marin stopped what she was doing. In 9 years of knowing Selleck, she had never seen him nervous. He told her in his clicking, buzzing language that her translator rendered into flat English that someone had been asking about her. Not asking about a human trader, asking about her specifically. By name, by ship registration, by cargo history. Someone from the blue ship. Marin set down the container she was holding. She asked Selleck what they wanted. He said he did not know. They had asked questions and then returned to their ship. But the questions had been detailed. They wanted to know how long she had been docking at Relay 14. They wanted to know her usual routes. They wanted to know if she traveled alone. Marin thanked Selleck. She gave him the dried fruit she had brought, and then she went back to her ship and locked the door. Everywhere I go to see her caught up. She sat in the pilot seat for a long time, thinking. Outside the viewport, the station hummed with its usual activity. Ships came and went. Cargo moved from dock to dock. The stars hung beyond the station's thin walls, bright and indifferent. Marin was not a person who panicked. She had survived a hull breach at 19. She had navigated through a debris field that killed 3 other ships. She had once talked her way out of a confrontation with pirates by convincing them her cargo was radioactive, which it was not, but the Geiger counter she had rigged to click at random intervals had been very convincing. But this was different. The Wraith did not ask questions casually. They did not send diplomatic vessels to random relay stations to satisfy curiosity. If they were asking about her, it meant someone in the Concord had decided she was worth paying attention to. And in Marin's experience, the Wraith paid attention to things they intended to control. She finished loading her cargo in half the time she normally would have. She did not check for damage. She did not organize the containers properly. She simply threw everything into the hold, sealed it, and began her pre-flight sequence. The drifter's engine coughed, as it always did. The navigation computer took an extra 30 seconds to boot, as it always did. Marin's hands were steady on the controls, but her heart was beating fast, and she could feel the cold still sitting in her stomach, heavier now. She requested departure clearance from Selleck. He gave it immediately, without the usual complaint about paperwork. That told her more than his words had. Selleck was scared too. The drifter pulled away from Relay 14, slow and ungraceful, like an old bird leaving a wire. Marin watched the station shrink in her rear display. She watched the blue Erath ship sitting in its berth, elegant and still. It did not move. She let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. She set her course for New Thessaly. She told herself she was overreacting. She told herself that traders got asked about all the time. She told herself that the Erath had bigger concerns than one small cargo hauler running back routes. 4 hours later, the drifter's rear sensors detected a ship following her. It was not the blue vessel from Relay 14. It was smaller, faster, and running without identification signals. It was matching her speed exactly, staying at a distance that said it did not want to catch her yet. It wanted to follow her. It wanted to see where she went. Marin stared at the sensor display for a full minute. Then she pulled up her navigation charts and began looking for places to disappear. The outer territories were full of such places. Dead systems, gas clouds that scrambled sensors, asteroid fields thick enough to hide a fleet. Marin knew them all. She had been flying these routes since she was 25, and she had always paid attention to the terrain, not because she expected to be chased, but because she was human, and humans had a long history of needing places to run to. She chose a gas cloud 3 hours away. It was a remnant of a star that had died long before any species in this part of the galaxy had learned to build fires. The gas was thick with ionized particles that would blind any sensor suite. Once inside, she would be invisible. She adjusted her course, not sharply because sharp turns announced fear, but gradually, as if she was simply correcting for a navigational preference. She watched the following ship. It adjusted with her. Smooth, professional, patient. Marin's jaw tightened. She was not going to make this easy for them. She spent the next 3 hours doing something that would have confused any observer. She talked to her ship, not metaphorically. She literally spoke to the drifter, running through scenarios out loud, because she thought better when she could hear her own voice. She discussed angles of approach. She calculated how long the gas cloud would hide her. She debated whether the following ship had already reported her position to others. And then, 15 minutes before she reached the gas cloud, she did something that the ship behind her did not expect. She cut her engine entirely. The drifter went dark. No engine signature. No electromagnetic output. No heat beyond the fading warmth of a cooling hull. In the void of space, the ship became a rock, a dead, drifting piece of metal, indistinguishable from the countless fragments of debris that littered the outer territories. Marin sat in the dark. She had shut off everything except her passive sensors, which listened without broadcasting. The life support was off. The heat was off. She wrapped herself in her 3 blankets and breathed slowly, conserving oxygen, conserving warmth, conserving everything. The following ship flew past her. She watched it on passive sensors. A bright dot of energy against the black moving toward the gas cloud where it expected to find her. It reached the cloud. It circled. It searched. It did not find her. Marin waited 2 more hours in the dark, until the cold was deep enough to make her fingers shake, and her breath was coming in clouds that froze against the viewport. Then she restarted her engine, turned 90 degrees away from her original course, and flew toward a destination that was not on any chart. She did not go to New Thessaly. She could not risk leading whoever was following her to a colony full of people. Instead, she went to the one place she knew no Ererath vessel would follow willingly. She went to the graveyard. The graveyard was what humans called a stretch of space near the border of Kothari territory where, 200 years ago, a war had been fought between species whose names no one remembered anymore. The war had been brief and total. Both sides had lost. What remained was a field of wreckage so vast it took days to cross, filled with the twisted hulls of warships, the scattered remains of stations, and the silent, frozen bodies of soldiers who had died in a conflict that the galaxy had already forgotten. No one went to the graveyard. The wreckage was too dense for safe navigation. The old weapon systems, damaged but not always dead, made the field dangerous in unpredictable ways. And there were stories, the kind that traders told in low voices over bad drinks, about signals that still broadcast from deep within the field. Voices, alarms, distress calls in languages that no translation system could pass. Marin had been to the graveyard once before, 5 years ago, when a navigational error had brought her too close to its edge. She had spent 6 terrifying hours navigating her way back out, threading the drifter through gaps in the wreckage that were barely wider than her ship. She had sworn she would never go back, but she remembered the way in. And more importantly, she remembered a place deep inside the field where the wreckage formed a kind of pocket, a hollow space surrounded on all sides by metal and debris, invisible to any sensor, protected from any weapon. A place where a small ship could hide for as long as it needed to. The drifter entered the graveyard at the speed of a walking human, its sensors working overtime to map the debris ahead. Marin flew manually, her hands on the controls, her eyes on the display, guiding her ship through gaps that required precision she had not known she possessed. Around her, the dead ships hung in the void like monuments. Some were enormous, kilometers long, their hulls torn open to reveal the bones of their construction. Some were small fighters and shuttles, frozen in the positions they had held at the moment of their destruction. In one, visible through a shattered viewport, Marin saw a shape that might have been a pilot, still strapped to its seat, still reaching for controls that would never respond. She did not look for long. It took her 14 hours to reach the pocket. When she arrived, she powered down the drifter's engine and let the ship drift into the center of the hollow space. She activated a low-power beacon that broadcast on a frequency only her ship could receive, a breadcrumb that would help her find her way out when the time came. Then she opened a channel on her communication system and began listening, not broadcasting, just listening. Because Marin had learned in her years of flying the back routes that the galaxy was full of conversations that people thought were private. Aerith diplomatic channels, Cathari military frequencies, Venari merchant codes. All of them leaked, if you knew where to listen and had the patience to wait. She waited, and 3 days later, wrapped in her blankets in the dark of the graveyard, she heard her own name spoken in the silver-tongued voice of an Erath commander, and she learned exactly why they were hunting her. It was not because of the back routes. It was not because she had avoided their checkpoints. It was not because she was inconvenient. It was because of what she was carrying in her cargo hold, hidden beneath 43 containers of medical supplies. Something she had picked up 6 months ago on a dead station in the outer belt. Something she had not understood at the time. Something she had kept because it was strange and because a voice in the back of her mind had told her it was important. It was an Erath data core. And inside it was every agreement, every contract, every secret clause that the Erath Concord had used to control humanity for the last century. Trade restrictions, economic manipulation, political interference. All of it documented in the Erath's own precise musical language, undeniable and damning. Marin sat in the dark and listened to the Erath commander explain, in cold and careful words, that the human woman must be found and eliminated before she understood what she possessed. She looked down at her hands, still shaking from the cold. She understood now, and she was not going to run any more. The graveyard was not silent. That was the first thing Marin noticed after spending 3 days inside it. The galaxy made sounds even in places where no one was listening. Metal groaned as old warships expanded and contracted in the shifting heat of distant stars. Fragments of hulls scraped against each other, slow and grinding like teeth in a restless sleep. And beneath it all, underneath every physical noise, there were the signals. Faint, broken, repeating. Emergency broadcasts from ships that had been dead for 2 centuries, still cycling through their automated distress calls because no one had ever come to turn them off. Marin listened to all of it. She had always been good at listening. Her mother had told her once, when Marin was still a child on the mining station where she had been born, that the universe was constantly trying to tell you something, and that most people were too busy talking to hear it. Marin had taken this seriously. She had spent her life paying attention to things other people ignored. The way an engine sounded before it failed. The way a trader's voice changed when they were lying about their cargo. The way the stars looked different through a viewport when a storm was building in the space between them. Now she was listening to the Erath, and what she heard changed everything she thought she knew. The data core was sitting on the floor of her sleeping quarters, wrapped in a piece of old fabric. It was not much to look at. A cylinder about the length of her forearm, made of a dark metal that felt warm to the touch no matter how cold the air around it became. One end was sealed with a cap that bore the spiral symbol of the Araith Concorde. The other end had a port that Marin had never been able to connect to anything in her ship because it used a format that human technology could not read. She had found it 6 months ago on Station Kepler 9, a decommissioned research outpost in the outer belt that had been abandoned after a coolant system failure killed its crew. Marin had gone there looking for salvage. The station was picked clean by the time she arrived. Every useful piece of equipment already taken by faster scavengers, but in a storage locker that someone had overlooked, tucked behind a panel that had warped in the heat of the coolant explosion, she had found the cylinder. She had not known what it was. She had kept it because it was clearly alien technology, and alien technology, even broken alien technology, add value on the right markets. She had planned to sell it at New Thessaly, where a Venari dealer she trusted could identify it and find a buyer. Now she knew what it was. And she knew it was worth more than anything she had ever carried. The intercepted Eretha communication had been detailed. A commander named Vasharath, speaking to a senior intelligence officer aboard a vessel called the Whisper of Dawn, had laid out the situation with the kind of cold precision that made Marin's skin prickle. The data core had been stolen from an Araith secure facility by a Kothari spy 4 years ago. The spy had been caught and killed, but the core had vanished into the black market. The Araith had been searching for it ever since, quietly, because the contents of the core could not be allowed to reach any species outside the Concorde, especially not humans. Vasharath had listed what the core contained, and Marin had listened with a feeling she could only describe as the floor dropping away beneath her feet. Every trade agreement the Araith had signed with human governments for the past century was in that core, not just the public versions, the ones that human leaders had agreed to and that human citizens had been told about. The real versions, the ones with the hidden clauses. Clauses that gave the Araith veto power over human colonial expansion. Clauses that allowed Araith intelligence operatives to monitor human communications without consent. Clauses that required human governments to share all scientific and technological discoveries with the Concorde before making them public. Clauses that set maximum limits on human military capability, ensuring that humanity could never build a fleet large enough to challenge Araith dominance. And buried deepest of all, in a section that Vasharath mentioned with something that sounded almost like embarrassment, were the economic controls. The Araith had been manipulating the human economy for decades, not dramatically, not in ways that caused immediate suffering, but steadily, consistently, nudging trade flows and resource prices in directions that kept human colonies dependent on Erath markets. When a human colony prospered too quickly, the Erath adjusted. When a human technology threatened to make a Concorde product obsolete, the Erath applied pressure through trade restrictions that appeared natural but were anything but. It was, Marin realized, a cage, an invisible cage built from contracts and economics and the careful manipulation of trust. And humanity had been living inside it for 100 years without knowing it. She sat in the dark of the graveyard, wrapped in her blankets, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not fear. She had moved past fear somewhere in the last 3 days. It was anger. Deep, slow, burning anger. The kind that did not make you rash, but made you very, very focused. She needed to read that data core. And to read it, she needed technology that could interface with Arath systems. There was only one place in the outer territories where she could find that. Marin spent another day in the graveyard, preparing. She charged the Drifter's batteries from a power cell she had salvaged from one of the dead warships, a risky operation that involved cutting into the hull of a vessel that had been dead for 200 years and hoping its reactor had not left behind anything that would kill her. It had not, though the radiation levels made her nervous enough to wear a suit she normally saved for emergency spacewalks. She reorganized her cargo hold, moving the medical supplies to create a hidden compartment behind the main containers. The data core went in there, sealed behind a panel that looked identical to every other panel in the hold. You would have to know it was there to find it. Marin intended to make sure no one got close enough to look. She plotted her course carefully. The destination was a place called the Knot, a free station built into an asteroid in the unclaimed space between Cathari and Venari territory. The Knot had no government. It had no laws except the ones enforced by the people who lived there, which mostly came down to 2 rules. Do not steal from other residents, and do not bring trouble that you cannot handle yourself. The knot was where the galaxy's outcasts gathered, smugglers, engineers who had been expelled from legitimate institutions for asking questions they were not supposed to ask, scientists whose research had been declared dangerous by one government or another, and among them, a small community of humans who had chosen to live outside the Araeth-controlled trade networks entirely. Marin knew a person at the knot. Her name was Devi Krishnamurthy, and she was the finest engineer Marin had ever met. Devi had worked for a human corporation that built communication satellites until she had discovered that the satellites contained Araeth monitoring equipment that her employer had agreed to install as part of a trade deal. She had reported this to her government. Her government had told her to be quiet. She had refused. 2 weeks later, she had been fired, her certifications revoked, and her name added to an employment blacklist that ensured no legitimate company would hire her. Devi had gone to the knot, where she built and repaired equipment for anyone who could pay, and where she maintained a personal project that she called her life's work. She was building a universal interface, a device that could connect to and communicate with the technology of any known species. She had been working on it for 7 years. According to her last message to Marin, sent 4 months ago, she was close to finishing. The journey from the graveyard to the knot took 8 days. Marin flew carefully, using routes that kept her far from any Araeth patrol zone. She changed course randomly, doubling back on herself, cutting through systems that had nothing in them worth visiting. She watched her sensors constantly, looking for the telltale signature of a ship running without identification. She saw nothing, but the absence of visible pursuit did not comfort her, because Marin had learned something important about the Araeth in the past few days. They were patient. They did not chase. They positioned. They waited. They let their target feel safe, and then they closed the trap from every direction at once. She arrived at the knot on the 9th day, sliding the drifter into a docking port carved directly into the asteroid's surface. The knot was not beautiful. It was a maze of tunnels and chambers cut from rock, lit by salvaged lighting systems that gave everything a faint yellow glow. The air smelled of metal and cooking oil and the particular sharp scent of solder that meant someone nearby was building something. Devi was in her workshop, a large chamber near the center of the asteroid that was filled with equipment from a dozen different species. Cables hung from the ceiling like vines. Circuit boards covered every flat surface. In the center of the chaos, surrounded by tools and empty food containers, Devi sat at a workbench, soldering something so small that Marin could not see it without magnification. Devi was a small woman, shorter than Marin, with dark hair streaked grey at the temples and hands that were permanently stained with chemical residue. She wore glasses that magnified her eyes to nearly twice their natural size, giving her the appearance of a very serious owl. She looked up when Marin entered, and showed no surprise at all, as if she had been expecting her. Marin explained the situation. She did it simply, without drama, laying out the facts the way she would describe a cargo manifest. She had an Araeth data core. The core contained evidence that the Araeth had been controlling humanity through hidden treaty clauses for a century. The Araeth wanted the core back and were willing to kill her to get it. She needed to read the core. She needed Devi's universal interface. Devi listened without interrupting. When Marin finished, Devi took off her glasses, cleaned them on her shirt, put them back on, and said 4 words. She said, "I need 3 days." Marin spent those 3 days doing something she hated. She waited. She walked the tunnels of the knot, buying food from vendors and drinking bitter coffee in common areas where smugglers and outcasts swapped stories. She listened, as she always did, and what she heard confirmed what she had already suspected. The Araeth were tightening their grip. New trade regulations had been announced that would make independent shipping nearly impossible. New monitoring protocols were being installed at relay stations across the outer territories. A Venari trader told her that 3 human colonies had been denied expansion permits in the last month alone, all for reasons that seemed designed to prevent them from becoming self-sufficient. The cage was getting smaller. On the 2nd day, something happened that made the hairs on the back of Marin's neck stand up. A ship arrived at the knot, a small passenger vessel registered to a Venari transport company. There was nothing unusual about it. Venari ships came and went from the knot regularly, but Marin noticed that the pilot, a tall figure in a hooded coat, moved through the station with the careful precision of someone who was looking for something specific and did not want to be noticed doing it. Marin followed the figure at a distance. She watched them visit 3 different common areas, scanning the crowds with quick, practiced glances. She watched them stop at a vendor's stall and ask questions, leaning in close, speaking too quietly for Marin to hear. She went back to Devi's workshop and told her what she had seen. Devi did not look up from her work. She said calmly that the knot had been infiltrated before. The Arraeth had tried it twice in the last 5 years. Both times the infiltrators had been identified and expelled. The knot's residents were suspicious people by nature. It was one of their better qualities, but Marin was not reassured. She began sleeping in the drifter instead of the guest quarters Devi had offered her. She kept the ship's engine on standby, warm and ready. She kept the data core hidden in its compartment and checked the seals twice a day. On the 3rd day, Devi called her to the workshop. The universal interface was a device about the size of a dinner plate, circular, with contacts around its edge that glowed with a faint blue light. It looked simple. Marin knew it was not. 7 years of work had gone into making it look simple. Devi placed the Arraeth data core on the interface. The contacts adjusted automatically, extending and reshaping themselves to match the port on the core's open end. There was a sound, soft and musical, that Marin realized was the core activating for the first time since she had found it. Data began flowing across Devi's screens. Aerith script, elegant and flowing, cascaded down the displays. Devi's interface translated it in real time, converting the alien language into English text that filled screen after screen. Marin read, and as she read, the anger that had been burning slowly in her chest for days caught fire. It was worse than the intercepted communication had suggested. The hidden clauses were just the beginning. The core contained internal Aerithate documents, memos and strategy papers and intelligence assessments that revealed the full scope of the Concorde's plans for humanity. It was not simply control. It was managed decline. The Irrwraith had determined, based on their study of human history and human nature, that humanity was uniquely dangerous, not because of human technology, which was crude compared to Aerith systems, not because of human military power, which was negligible, but because of human unpredictability. The Arraeth valued order above all things. Their society was built on predictability, on systems that functioned exactly as designed, on outcomes that could be calculated centuries in advance. Humans, by contrast, were chaotic. They adapted too quickly. They innovated too freely. They had a tendency to destroy systems they found oppressive and build new ones from the wreckage, often better ones. And they did this with the speed that the Arraeth found terrifying. The strategy documents were clear. Humanity must be contained, not destroyed, because destruction would be noticed by other species and might provoke sympathy, but contained. Kept dependent, kept small, kept busy with internal problems, economic pressures and resource scarcity, and political divisions that would prevent them from ever reaching the level of development where they could challenge the Concorde's position. And it was working. The documents showed graphs, projections, assessments that demonstrated how human expansion had slowed, how human technological development had plateaued, how human colonies had become increasingly dependent on Arraeth markets for basic necessities. The Arraeth were pleased with the results. They projected that within another 50 years, humanity would be permanently integrated into the Concorde's economic system, unable to function without it, and no longer a threat. Marin read all of it, every document, every memo, every cold, calculated assessment of her species as a problem to be managed. It took her 6 hours. When she finished, her eyes were dry and her jaw was clenched so tightly that her teeth ached. Devi, who had been reading alongside her, took off her glasses and set them on the workbench. Her hands were shaking. Not with fear, with the same fury that Marin felt. Marin asked Devi if she could copy the core's contents. Devi said she could. She asked if she could convert it into formats that could be broadcast on human communication networks. Devi said she could do that too. Marin asked how long it would take. Devi said 12 hours. Marin said she might not have 12 hours. The hooded figure she had seen the day before was still at the knot, and there might be others she had not seen. Devi looked at her. Behind her magnified glasses, her eyes were steady. She said she would work fast. Marin went back to the drifter. She checked her fuel. She checked her engine. She checked the hidden compartment where the data core was no longer sitting. Because it was still in Devi's workshop connected to the interface, the compartment was empty, and its emptiness made her nervous. She sat in the pilot's seat and pulled up her navigation charts. She needed a plan. Not just a plan to survive, a plan to get the contents of that data core to every human colony, every human government, every human being who had been living inside the Wraith's invisible cage without knowing it. The problem was transmission. Human communication networks were monitored by the Wraith. Any broadcast large enough to reach every colony would be detected and blocked within minutes. The Wraith controlled the relay stations. They controlled the signal amplifiers. They controlled the infrastructure that made long-distance communication possible. But they did not control everything. Marin pulled up a map of the outer territories and began marking locations. Not relay stations, not signal amplifiers, something else. Something that the Aerith had overlooked because it was old, and because it was human, and because the Wraith, for all their intelligence, had a blind spot when it came to things they considered primitive. Buried in the old colony records, in files that most people had forgotten existed, were the coordinates of humanity's first communication network, built during the earliest days of human expansion, before the Wraith had offered their technology, before the trade agreements, before the cage. A network of simple, powerful signal boosters that humanity had installed across the outer territories to maintain contact between its far-flung colonies. The Wraith had made this network obsolete by offering superior alternatives. Most of the boosters had been decommissioned. But decommissioned did not mean destroyed. They were still out there, floating in space, dormant but intact, waiting for someone to turn them back on. There were 47 of them. Marin had found references to them years ago, during one of her long nights of reading old records to plan her trade routes. She had noted their locations out of curiosity. She had never imagined she would need them. Now she needed them. If she could reactivate even half of those boosters, she could create a broadcast network that the Wraith did not control, a network that could carry the contents of the data core to every human settlement in the outer territories simultaneously. The Wraith could block the official channels. They could not block a ghost network they did not know existed. Marin began calculating. Distances, travel times, power requirements. She would need to visit each booster individually, reactivate it manually, program it with the broadcast frequency and content. It would take weeks, and she would be doing it while the Wraith hunted her. She smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a person who had just realized that the only way forward was through, and that through was going to hurt. Devi finished the copy in 9 hours, 3 hours ahead of schedule. She delivered it to Marin on a storage device the size of a thumbnail, encrypted with a code that Devi had designed herself and that she claimed would take even Wraith computers years to break. She also gave Marin something else, a small tool, hand-built, that could interface with old human technology and bring dormant systems back online. She had built it during the 3 hours she had saved on the copy. Marin stared at her. She had not told Devi about the signal boosters. She had not told anyone. Devi shrugged. She said she had read the same old colony records. She said she had been thinking about those boosters for years. She said she had always known that someday someone would need them. Marin took the tool and the storage device. She returned the original data core to its hiding place in the drifter's cargo hold. She looked at Devi. This small woman with her enormous glasses and her chemical-stained hands, and she did not know what to say. Devi told her not to get caught. Then she went back to her workbench and picked up her soldering iron, because she was already working on the next thing, because that was what engineers did. Marin left the knot quietly, in the gap between shift changes when the docking area was least busy. She slipped the drifter out of its berth and into the darkness between the stars. Behind her, still docked at the knot, the Venari passenger vessel sat with its engines cold. The hooded figure was nowhere to be seen. But as the drifter pulled away from the asteroid, Marin's passive sensors detected something. A brief transmission, so short it was barely more than a pulse, sent from the knot toward arrived space. Someone had seen her leave. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and Marin Okoro, alone in her battered cargo ship with the evidence of a century of manipulation hidden in her hold, and a plan that required her to cross half the galaxy while the most powerful species in known space tried to kill her, set her jaw and pointed the drifter toward the first signal booster on her list. It was 17 days away. The booster was floating in orbit around a dead planet in an empty system that had no name, only a number. No one had visited it in 50 years. Marin settled into her seat, pulled her blankets around her shoulders, and began to fly. The first booster was exactly where the old records said it would be. It hung in orbit around a planet that had never been given a proper name because there had never been a reason to name it. The planet was grey and cratered and dead, without atmosphere, without water, without anything that any species would consider worth fighting over. The booster itself was a metal cylinder about twice the length of the drifter, covered in a thin layer of dust that had accumulated from 50 years of drifting through microscopic debris. Solar panels extended from its sides like broken wings, dark and dormant, waiting for power that had stopped flowing decades ago. Marin brought the drifter alongside it carefully. Spacewalks were dangerous under the best conditions, and these were not the best conditions. She was alone. There was no one to monitor her suit pressure, no one to pull her back if her tether snapped, no one to call for help if something went wrong. She had done solo spacewalks before, but never with this much at stake. She suited up in the drifter's small airlock. The suit was old, like everything else she owned, patched at the knees and elbows with material from 3 different manufacturers. But it held pressure, and the oxygen supply was full, and the magnetic boots worked, which was what mattered. She crossed the gap between the drifter and the booster using a tether line she had anchored to the drifter's hull. The distance was only about 20 meters, but in the vacuum, with the dead planet turning slowly beneath her and the stars burning in every direction, it felt like crossing an ocean. The booster's access panel was on the side facing away from the planet. Marin pulled herself along the cylinder's surface using handholds that had been designed for exactly this purpose by human engineers who had built this thing half a century ago with the understanding that someday, someone might need to service it. She found the panel, pried it open with a tool from her belt and looked inside. The internal systems were intact, dusty and cold, but intact. The construction was simple and solid, the kind of engineering that humans had practiced before the Ariath had convinced them that complexity was superior. Marin could see every component, understand every connection, trace every wire from source to destination. There was no elegance here, no alien grace, just function. Just a machine built to do one thing and do it well. She pulled out the tool Devi had given her. It was a small device with a universal connector on one end and a display on the other. She plugged it into the booster's main control port. The display lit up, showing her the booster's status. Power cells depleted. Communication array offline. Signal processor in standby mode. Memory banks empty. Marin began the reactivation sequence. She routed power from a portable battery she had brought with her, enough to wake the booster's solar panels. The panels shuddered, then began to extend, unfolding slowly, catching the distant light of the system's sun. It would take hours for them to generate enough power to bring the booster fully online, but the process was started. While the panels charged, she programmed the booster's signal processor. She loaded the broadcast frequency she had chosen, a band that human communication systems used, but that the Ariath had never bothered to monitor because they considered it primitive and low capacity. She loaded the encryption key that Devi had created, and she loaded the content, the translated data from the Ariath core, formatted into a compressed package that could be received and decoded by any standard human communication device. She did not load the broadcast command. Not yet. The booster would charge, accept its programming, and wait. When the time came when enough boosters were active and programmed, Marin would send a single activation signal, and they would all broadcast simultaneously, flooding human space with the truth. The work took 4 hours. By the time she finished, her suit's oxygen was getting low and her fingers were numb from the cold that seeped through her gloves despite their insulation. She sealed the access panel, crossed back to the drifter on her tether line, and collapsed in the airlock as the pressure equalized around her. 1 down, 46 to go. She did not have time to rest. Every hour she spent motionless was an hour the Ariath could use to close the distance between their hunters and her ship. She ate a meal of rehydrated protein and stale crackers while the drifter's engine warmed up. She plotted her course to the second booster, 8 days away, in a system that old charts called the Furnace because its star burned white and hot and close to every object in its orbit. The drifter moved, and behind it, somewhere in the vast dark, the hunters moved too. Marin reached the second booster without incident. She reactivated it in 3 hours, faster now that she knew the process. The third booster, 6 days later, took her only 2.5 hours. By the fourth booster, she had developed a routine. Arrive, scan the area, dock alongside the booster, suit up, cross, open, connect, program, seal, return, move on. Each booster was different in small ways. Some had sustained damage from micrometeorites. Some had power cells that still held a faint charge, making the reactivation easier. One, the fifth on her list, was tangled in a web of debris from a collision with a small asteroid, and Marin had to spend 2 hours cutting it free before she could access the panel. But they all worked. Every single one. 50 years of dormancy, and the old human engineering held. Marin found herself developing a strange affection for the boosters, these forgotten machines that her species had built and abandoned. They had been made to connect people. That was their only purpose. And they had waited, patient and silent, for someone to give them purpose again. By the time she reached the 7th booster, 3 weeks had passed since she had left the knot. She had settled into a rhythm that was equal parts exhausting and meditative. Fly. Arrive! Work! Fly again. Sleep in fragments when she could. Eat whatever was available. Talk to the drifter, because the sound of her own voice kept the loneliness from becoming something worse. It was at the 7th booster that the Araeth found her. She was outside the ship, connected to the booster by her tether, hands inside the access panel, when the drifter's proximity alarm sounded. The alarm was muffled by her suit, but she felt it through the tether line, a vibration that traveled from the ship to the cable to her body, and she knew immediately what it meant. She looked up. Against the field of stars, a shape moved. Sleek, dark, running without lights, visible only because it blocked the stars behind it as it passed. Anareth Interceptor, designed for exactly this kind of work. Fast enough to catch anything in the outer territories, armed enough to destroy anything it caught. Crewed by Aerith hunters, the Concord's specialist operatives, trained to track and eliminate targets that the Concord wanted gone. Marin did not panic. She had been expecting this. Not here specifically, but somewhere, eventually. The Araeth were patient, but they were not stupid. They would have analyzed her movements, searched for patterns, tried to predict where she was going. She had done her best to be unpredictable, but there were only so many routes through the outer territories, and a sufficiently advanced intelligence operation could narrow the possibilities. She finished programming the booster. Her hands were steady. The work took another 12 minutes. 12 minutes during which the interceptor grew larger in her field of vision, closing the distance with the silent efficiency of a predator that knew its prey could not escape. She sealed the panel. She crossed back to the drifter, moving carefully on her tether, resisting the urge to rush because rushing in zero gravity meant mistakes and mistakes in zero gravity meant death. She reached the airlock. She cycled through. She pulled off her helmet and ran to the cockpit. The interceptor was close now, close enough for her senses to read its profile. It was a Whisper-class vessel, named, with typical Eroweight poetry, after its most notable characteristic. Whisper-class ships were fast, they were quiet, and they carried a weapon that the Araeth called the Silence, a focused energy beam that could cut through a ship's hull the way a hot wire cut through ice. Marin started the drifter's engine. It coughed. It always coughed. She had never minded the cough before. Now, with an Araeth interceptor bearing down on her, the 2 seconds it added to her startup sequence felt like an eternity. The engine caught. The drifter lurched forward. Behind her, the interceptor adjusted its course, matching her movement with the kind of smooth precision that made human piloting look like a child learning to walk. Marin did not try to outrun it. The drifter could not outrun a Whisper-class interceptor any more than a river barge could outrun a racing boat. Instead, she did what she always did when speed was not an option. She used the terrain. The system they were in had a dense asteroid belt, the remnants of a planet that had been destroyed by its own moon's gravity millions of years ago. The belt was thick with rocks ranging from pebbles to mountains, tumbling and spinning in a slow, chaotic dance. For most ships, the belt was an obstacle to be avoided. For Marin, it was a door. She flew the drifter into the belt at a speed that would have been considered reckless by any pilot with formal training. Asteroids filled her viewport, spinning past so close that she could see the individual craters on their surfaces. The drifter was not fast, but it was small, and Marin knew how to fly it the way a person knows how to move their own body, instinctively, without thinking, with the kind of precision that comes only from years of practice. The interceptor followed. It was faster, but it was also larger, and the belt did not care about the elegance of Aerith engineering. Rocks bounced off the interceptor's shields, each impact draining energy that the ship could not afford to lose. The Araeth pilot was good. Marin could tell by the way the interceptor moved, but good was not enough in an asteroid belt. The belt demanded something beyond skill. It demanded the willingness to accept damage, to let your ship get hit, to trust that it would hold together long enough to get you through. The Aerowaith were not willing. Their ships were precious to them, maintained with the same obsessive care they applied to everything. The interceptor pilot pulled back, unwilling to risk serious damage to the vessel in pursuit of a single human trader. Marin flew deeper into the belt, weaving between rocks, letting the asteroids close behind her like a curtain. She kept going for 2 hours, longer than necessary, until her senses confirmed that the interceptor had left the system entirely. Then she stopped the drifter behind a rock the size of a small city and let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the adrenaline that had been flooding her body for the past 2 hours and was now draining away, leaving her hollow and exhausted. She gripped the armrests of her pilot's seat and held on until the shaking stopped. She had survived. But the Arathair knew she was reactivating the boosters. They might not know exactly what she was doing with them. Not yet, but they knew her general location and her direction of travel. The next interceptor would be faster. The next encounter would not end with the hunter pulling back. Marin looked at her list of boosters. 7 done. 40 remaining. Weeks of work with the Arathair closing in. She needed help. She hated admitting it. She had been alone for so long that the idea of relying on anyone else felt like a weakness. But she was a practical woman, and practical women did not let pride kill them. She thought about the people she knew, traders, mechanics, station workers, people she had met over 9 years of flying the back routes. Most of them would not help her, not because they did not care, but because they had their own lives and their own problems, and because going against the Arathair was the kind of decision that ended careers and sometimes ended lives. But some of them might. She composed a message. It was short, because long messages attracted attention, and because Marin believed that if you could not explain something in a few sentences, you did not understand it well enough. She explained what she had found. She explained what the Arathair had been doing. She explained what she was trying to do about it. And she asked for help. She sent the message through a channel that the Arathair did not monitor, a system that human traders had been using for decades to share information without official oversight. It was called the WhisperNet, an ironic name given the circumstances, and it worked by embedding messages in the routine data transmissions that every ship sent during normal operations. To anyone monitoring from outside, the messages looked like engine diagnostics or navigation updates. To anyone who knew the code, there was something else entirely. She sent the message to 11 people. Then she continued to the next booster on her list. The responses came over the next several days, arriving as fragments buried in routine transmissions, decoded by the drifter's communication system into plain text that appeared on Marin's screen. 3 people did not respond. 2 responded with apologies, saying they could not help but wished her well. 1 responded with a single word that Marin's translator could not pass, and that she suspected was a Venari obscenity. 5 people said yes. The first was a man named Jonas Patel, who ran a fuel depot in a system called the Cradle. Jonas was 60 years old, had been a military pilot before he retired, and had a deep, uncomplicated hatred of anyone who tried to tell him what to do. He said he would help because the idea of the Arathair controlling humanity made him want to break things, and this seemed like a constructive way to channel that impulse. The second was a woman named Rin Takahashi, who captained a courier ship called the Bright Needle. Rin was fast and careful, and knew the outer territories almost as well as Marin did. She said she would help because she had a daughter on one of the colonies that the Arathair had been strangling economically, and she wanted that daughter to grow up free. The third was a pair, a married couple named Soren and Amara Lindgren, who operated a salvage vessel in the deep territories. They were quiet people, who spoke in short sentences, and worked with the synchronized efficiency of 2 people who had been together long enough to communicate without words. They said simply that they were in. The 5th was someone Marin had not expected to hear from. His name was Callum Webb, and he was not a trader or a pilot. He was a journalist. Or he had been before the publication he worked for had been shut down by a human government under pressure from Arathair economic sanctions. Callum had been investigating Arathair influence over human politics for years. He had gathered evidence. He had written reports. And every report had been suppressed, buried, or discredited before it could reach the public. Callum's message was the longest of the 5. He said he had been waiting for something like this. He said he had always known that somewhere, in some forgotten corner of the galaxy, the proof existed. He said he could not fly a ship or fix a booster, but he could do something else. He could prepare the information for human audiences. He could strip away the Araeth bureaucratic language and translate it into words that ordinary people would understand and believe. He could make the data not just available, but undeniable. Marin read his message 3 times. Then she sent him the encrypted contents of the data core. The plan expanded. Marin divided her remaining boosters among herself, Jonas, Rin, and the Lindgrens. Each would take a section of the outer territories, reactivate their assigned boosters, and program them with the broadcast content. They would work simultaneously, cutting the remaining time from weeks to days. When all boosters were active, Marin would send the activation signal, and the broadcast would begin. It was a good plan. It was a simple plan. And, like all plans involving the Araeth, it was about to become much more complicated. The complication arrived in the form of a fleet. Marin was 3 days into her new route, heading toward her 8th booster, when her long-range sensors detected something that made her stop chewing the cracker she was eating and stare at the display in silence. 12 ships. Not interceptors this time. Full warships. Araeth military vessels of a class that was normally deployed to enforce blockades around entire star systems. They were arranged in a formation that covered a volume of space so large that nothing could pass through it without being detected, and they were moving, slowly and methodically in her direction. The Araeth had stopped hunting with a knife. They had brought a wall. Marin studied the formation. It was a sweep pattern, designed to push anything in its path toward the edges of the territory or into a corner where escape became impossible. The ships were spaced far enough apart that their combined sensor coverage left no gaps. Anything larger than a basketball would be detected. The drifter was considerably larger than a basketball. She opened a channel to Jonas, Rin, and the Lindgrens. She shared the sensor data. The responses came back quickly. Jonas said something that was definitely an obscenity. Rin asked how long before the sweep reached their positions. The Lindgrens said nothing. But Marin could imagine them looking at each other in the way they did, communicating entire conversations in the space of a glance. Marin did the math. At the fleet's current speed, the sweep would reach the area of the remaining boosters in 6 days. They had programmed 15 boosters so far, counting the ones Marin had done alone. They needed at least 30 for the broadcast to reach all the major human colonies. That meant 15 more boosters in 6 days while avoiding 12 warships that were specifically looking for them. It was not possible. Marin knew it was not possible. The math did not work. The distances were too great, the time too short, the enemy too many. She sat in her pilot's seat and stared at the stars through the viewport. She thought about the data core hidden in her cargo hold. She thought about the words she had read on Devi's screens, the cold Araeth assessments of humanity as a problem to be managed, a species too chaotic to be trusted with its own future. She thought about the colonies, the millions of human beings going about their lives without knowing that every choice they made, every opportunity they pursued, every dream they dreamed had been carefully measured and limited by someone who had decided they did not deserve more. She thought about giving up. She held the thought in her mind for exactly 3 seconds, examined it the way she would examine a broken engine part, and then set it aside. She opened the channel again and told her people the new plan. They would not get all the boosters. They would get as many as they could. They would work faster, take more risks, and accept that the broadcast might not reach everyone. But it would reach enough. Enough to start a conversation. Enough to plant a seed of doubt. Enough to make people ask questions that the Araeth could not afford to have answered. And if the Araeth caught them, if the warships closed in and the silence cut through their hulls and everything ended in the cold dark between the stars, then at least they would have tried. At least they would have done something. At least they would not have sat quietly in their cage and accepted it. Jonas laughed. It was a rough, angry laugh. The laugh of a man who had spent 60 years learning that the universe was unfair and had never once accepted it. He said he was not planning on dying. He said the Araeth would have to work harder than that. Rin said nothing for a long moment. Then she said her daughter's name. Just the name, as if that was all the explanation needed. The Lindgrens said they were already moving. Marin set her course for the next booster and pushed the drifter's engine harder than she had ever pushed it before. The old ship groaned. The hull vibrated. The heating system, which had been struggling with just the left side of the vessel, gave up entirely. And the temperature inside dropped to a level that made Marin's breath visible. She wrapped herself in her blankets, gripped the controls, and flew toward the wall of warships that was closing in from the darkness ahead. Behind her, the 7 boosters she had activated hung in their orbits, silent and charged, their programming loaded, their signals waiting. Ahead of her, the 8th booster waited in the void, and somewhere in a room that Marin would never see, aboard a ship she would never board, Erath Commander Vasharath stared at a tactical display showing the sweep formation's progress and wondered, not for the first time, why humans were so difficult to predict. His second officer, a young Erath named Fasan, asked if the commander expected the human woman to surrender. Vasharath was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that his crew would remember for years afterward. He said no. He said that in all his study of human behavior, in all the intelligence reports and psychological profiles and historical analyses he had reviewed, he had never once encountered a human who surrendered when they believed they were right. He said this was what made them dangerous. And he said, with a heaviness in his musical voice that sounded almost like respect, that he was beginning to understand why the Concorde feared them. The Arath suite moved like a tide. It was not fast. It did not need to be. 12 warships, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a small moon, pushed through the outer territories with the patience of something that had never known urgency. Their sensors reached outward in overlapping cones, scanning everything, cataloguing everything, leaving nothing unchecked. Every rock, every piece of debris, every stray signal was noted, analyzed, and classified. If it was not a human ship, it was ignored. If it might be a human ship, a probe was dispatched to verify. Marin watched the sweep's progress on her long-range sensors. She had positioned the drifter behind a rogue planetoid, a chunk of rock about the size of a small country that had been ejected from its home system by some ancient gravitational event and had been wandering through the void ever since. The planetoid's mass created enough interference to hide her ship's signature, but she could not stay here long. The sweep would pass this area in less than 2 days, and the planetoid would not hide her from close-range scans. She had activated 3 more boosters in the past 4 days, bringing her personal count to 10. Jonas had activated 4. Rin had activated 3. The Lindgrens, working with their characteristic silent efficiency, had activated 5. Total active boosters, 22. They needed 30 to cover all the major human colonies. 8 more boosters in less than 2 days, with 12 warships closing in. Marin pulled up the locations of the remaining boosters on her navigation chart and stared at them until her eyes ached. They were scattered across a region of space that was directly in the path of the Arath sweep. There was no way to reach them all without crossing through the warship's sensor coverage. No back route, no gas cloud, no trick of navigation that could make her invisible. She needed a different approach. She opened a channel to her team. The signal bounced through 3 dead relay stations, each one adding another layer of encryption before reaching its recipients. It was slow and clumsy, but it was secure. She asked a question that she had been turning over in her mind for the last 6 hours. She asked if any of them knew how to make an Erath warship look the wrong way. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Marin thought the connection had dropped. Then Jonas spoke. His voice was rough, the voice of a man who was running on caffeine and stubbornness. He said he had an idea, but that Marin was not going to like it. He was right. She did not like it. Jonas proposed that he fly his ship directly toward the Arath formation. Not to attack, not to surrender, to distract. His ship, a converted mining vessel called the Red Hammer, was large enough to show up on Erath sensors from a considerable distance. If he approached the formation from one side, making himself visible, transmitting on open channels, behaving like a ship that was either lost or foolish or both, the Arath would have to respond. They would dispatch ships to intercept him. They would redirect attention to his sector of the sweep, and in the gap that his distraction created, the others could slip through and reach the remaining boosters. Marin said no. She said it immediately without hesitation, because what Jonas was describing was not a distraction, it was a sacrifice. The Erath would not simply intercept him. They would board his ship. They would search it. They would find evidence of his involvement, and then they would do what the Arath did to people who challenged the Concorde. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Marin would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said that he was 60 years old. He said that he had spent 30 of those years flying ships and 30 of those years being told where he could fly them and how fast and what he could carry. He said that he had always known, somewhere deep in his bones, that there was something wrong with the deal humanity had been offered, and that knowing this and doing nothing about it had been eating at him for longer than Marin had been alive. He said that this was his chance to do something that mattered. He said he would rather spend his last years in an Erath prison knowing he had helped than spend them at his fuel depot knowing he had not. He said, "Please." Marin closed her eyes. She pressed her hands against her face and held them there until the tightness in her chest eased enough for her to breathe. She said, "Yes." Jonas began his approach 6 hours later. Marin watched on her senses as the red hammer moved toward the Erath formation, big and slow and brazenly visible. Jonas had turned on every light. He was broadcasting music on open channels, old earth rock and roll that Marin recognized from the playlists he played at his fuel depot. The sound of electric guitars and drums rolled across the void, picked up by Erath sensors that had never been designed to receive anything so chaotic. The formation reacted. 2 warships broke away from the sweep line and moved to intercept the red hammer. A third adjusted its position to cover the gap they had left. But the gap was there. A narrow corridor of space where the Erath sensor coverage was thin, where a small ship flying dark could slip through without being detected. Marin did not waste a second. She killed the drifter's active systems, dropping to passive sensors only, and flew toward the gap at a speed that pushed the ship's structural limits. Ahead of her, the corridor was narrow, bordered on both sides by the outer edges of Erath sensor cones. If she drifted too far in either direction, she would be visible. She had to fly a line so precise that the margin for error was measured in kilometers. She flew it. She held the drifter's course with the focused intensity of a person threading a needle at a dead run. The corridor slipped past her, and she was through, on the other side of the sweep, in clear space with no Erath ships between her and the remaining boosters. Rin came through behind her, the bright needle living up to its name, slicing through the gap with speed and precision. The Lindgrens followed in their salvage vessel, heavier and slower, but guided by Soren's piloting, which Marin had always suspected was better than he let on. Behind them, the gap closed as the Erath warships adjusted their formation. And on the far side of the sweep, Jonas continued his slow approach, music still playing, drawing the attention of the 2 intercepting warships. Marin forced herself to look away from Jonas's signal on her sensors and focus on what was ahead. The remaining boosters were spread across 4 systems. She assigned them quickly. 2 for her, 2 for Rin, 3 for the Lindgrens, who had the fastest route between their assigned locations. That left 1 booster unassigned, the farthest one, in a system that was almost 3 days away from any of their current positions. They could not reach it in time. 29 boosters, not 30. The broadcast would have a gap, a region of human space that would not receive the signal directly. Marin calculated which colonies fell in that gap: 2 mining outposts and a farming settlement called New Harmony. Combined population: about 12,000 people. 12,000 people who would not hear the truth when it was broadcast. Marin stared at the number, 12,000. It was a small number compared to the millions who would receive the signal. It was an acceptable loss by any strategic calculation. 1% of the population. A rounding error in the math of revolution. But those were people with names and families and lives that mattered just as much as anyone else's. Marin had delivered medicine to New Harmony once. She remembered the settlement, a cluster of domes on a green planet where the colonists grew wheat in soil they had spent decades making fertile. She remembered a child who had waved at her from a doorway. She remembered the taste of bread someone had given her. Real bread, baked from wheat grown in soil on a planet that humans had made livable through sheer stubborn effort. She could not leave them out. She ran the numbers again. The math did not change. 3 days to the last booster. The Aeroate sweep would reach her position in less than 2. There was no route, no shortcut, no trick that could get her there in time. Unless she did not go there at all. The idea came to her the way ideas always came, not as a flash of inspiration, but as a slow assembly of pieces that she had been carrying without knowing it. The boosters were dormant machines that needed to be reactivated manually. That was why she had been visiting each one in person. That was why the plan required weeks of dangerous travel. But Devi's universal interface had not just connected to the data core, it had connected to the boosters too, through the reactivation tool that Devi had built. The tool communicated with the boosters directly, using the same frequency and protocol that the original engineers had designed. What if the tool could communicate with a booster remotely? Marin pulled up the tool's specifications on the drifter's computer. Devi had designed it for close-range use within a few meters of the target. But the underlying protocol, The language the tool used to talk to the boosters was a simple radio transmission. Radio transmissions could travel any distance given enough power. The signal would be weak over 3 days of travel. It might not arrive intact, but if it did, it could wake the booster from a distance. The problem was power. The tool was small. Its transmission range was limited. Marin needed something to amplify the signal, something strong enough to push a radio transmission across 3 days of empty space. She looked at the drifter's communication array. It was not designed for this. It was a standard cargo hauler communication system, built for routine transmissions to stations and relay points. But it had an antenna, and the antenna had power, and power was what she needed. Marin spent the next hour modifying the drifter's communication system. She rerouted power from the heating system, which had stopped working days ago anyway, to the antenna. She connected Devi's tool to the communication array using a cable she made by splicing 3 different wires together. She wrote a command sequence that would transmit the full reactivation and programming instructions in a single compressed burst. The modification was ugly. The cable was held together with tape. The power routing looked like something a child would build in a school project. But Marin had learned long ago that elegance was a luxury and function was a necessity, and she did not have time for luxuries. She pointed the drifter's antenna toward the coordinates of the last booster, the one floating in orbit around a dwarf star 3 days away. She held her breath. She pressed the transmit button. The signal left the drifter at the speed of light, carrying the reactivation code, the broadcast content, and the programming instructions. It traveled outward through the void, growing weaker with every second, diluting into the noise of the universe. Marin had no way of knowing if it would arrive, no way of knowing if the signal would be strong enough, if the booster would hear it, if the programming would load correctly from a transmission that was never designed to travel this far. She had done the math, and the math said it was possible but unlikely. The probability of success was somewhere around 14%. She chose to believe it would work, not because she had evidence, but because she was human, and humans had a long and complicated relationship with hope that no amount of math could override. She turned the drifter toward her 2 remaining boosters and flew. The next 36 hours were the hardest of Marin's life. She activated her 9th and 10th boosters while the Arraeth sweep closed in from behind. She could see the warships on her long-range sensors now, not as distant signals but as visible shapes, their hulls catching the light of nearby stars. They were beautiful, she admitted to herself. The Arraeth built beautiful things. It was one of their great gifts, the ability to make everything they created look like it belonged in a museum. But a museum was a place where things were displayed behind glass, looked at but never touched, admired but never used, and Marin was done being someone else's exhibit. Rin activated her 2 boosters and sent a confirmation signal that was so brief it could have been a sensor glitch. The Lindgrens activated their 3 and disappeared into the asteroid belt of the system they were in, their salvage vessel blending with the wreckage as naturally as a fish blending with a reef. 29 boosters active, plus possibly the 30th if Marin's remote signal had worked. She would not know until she sent the activation command. She needed to send that command from somewhere the Arraeth could not jam it. The activation signal was simple, a single coded pulse on the frequency she had programmed into every booster. But if the Arraeth detected it before it reached all the boosters, they could broadcast the jamming signal on the same frequency and prevent the boosters from receiving the command. She needed to transmit from a location where the signal would reach all the boosters simultaneously, without passing through any area where an Arraeth warship was positioned. There was only one such location. It was at the center of the booster network, the point equidistant from all the active boosters, from which the signal would radiate outward in every direction at once. Marin calculated the coordinates. She stared at them. Then she laughed, a short, tired laugh that had no humor in it at all. The coordinates were in the middle of the Arraeth sweep formation, not on the edge, not in a gap. In the exact center, surrounded by warships on every side, she was going to have to fly directly into the formation, transmit the signal, and then deal with whatever happened next. She opened a channel to her team. She explained the situation. She told them what she was going to do. She told them that once she transmitted the activation signal, their job was done. The boosters would broadcast automatically. The information would reach the colonies. Whatever happened to her after that was irrelevant to the mission. Rin asked what Marin meant by irrelevant. Marin did not answer. Jonas, still being escorted by 2 Arraeth warships on the far side of the formation, broke into the channel. His voice was different now, tired but calm. with a steadiness that comes from having accepted something. He said that the Wraith had boarded his ship an hour ago. He said they had searched it and found nothing because he had never carried any evidence of his involvement in the plan. He said they were holding him for questioning, but had not harmed him. He said the music was still playing. He said he was proud to have known her. Marin closed the channel. She sat alone in the drifter's cockpit and looked at the stars. She thought about the child who had waved at her from the doorway on New Harmony. She thought about the bread. She thought about her mother who had told her to listen to the universe and who had died on a mining station that could not afford adequate medical supplies because the trade agreements that governed its economy had been written to ensure it never could. Yan. She set her course for the center of the Araeth formation. The drifter flew. The engine did not cough this time. It ran smooth and strong, as if the old ship understood what was about to happen and wanted to do its part. She hit the edge of the formation's sensor coverage at exactly 1400 hours by the drifter's clock. The moment she crossed the threshold, alarms sounded on every Araeth warship within range. She saw them on her sensors, 12 bright dots repositioning, turning, converging on her location like wolves toward a fire. Marin flew straight. She did not dodge. She did not weave. She flew directly toward the center point, the coordinates she had calculated, the place from which the activation signal would reach every booster in the network. The first Araeth weapon fired when she was 6 minutes from the center point. The silence beam passed close enough to the drifter that the ship's hull vibrated from the energy discharge. It was a warning shot. The Araeth were giving her a chance to stop. She did not stop. The second shot was not a warning. It struck the drifter's port side, cutting through the outer hull layer and venting the cargo hold to space. Marin felt the ship shudder. Alarm screamed. The navigation display flickered. She gripped the controls and kept flying. The medical supplies she had been carrying for New Thessaly, the supplies she had never delivered, tumbled out of the ruptured cargo hold into the void. Containers of medicine and water purification tablets and seed stock spun away into the darkness, a trail of humanitarian cargo marking her path like breadcrumbs. And with the medical supplies torn from its hidden compartment by the decompression, the Araeth data core flew into space. The original, the cylinder of dark metal that had started everything. Marin saw it on her rear sensors, tumbling end over end, catching the light of distant stars. She did not go back for it. She did not need it anymore. Everything it contained was already loaded into 30 boosters across the outer territories, waiting for her signal. 3 minutes from the center point, another silence beam struck the drifter, this time cutting through the engine housing. The ship's speed dropped. The engine screamed, a sound Marin had never heard it make, the sound of a machine being torn apart. She rerouted power from every non-essential system, stripping the drifter down to its bones, pushing every last watt into the engine to maintain forward momentum. 2 minutes. The Araeth warships were closing in from every direction now. She could see them through her viewport, not as dots on a sensor display, but as actual ships, their hulls gleaming, their weapons glowing. They were beautiful and terrible, and they were going to destroy her ship. 1 minute. The drifter was dying. She could feel it in the vibrations that ran through the hull, in the way the controls responded sluggishly, in the silence that was spreading through the ship as system after system failed. The heating was gone. The sensors were going. The lighting flickered and went dark, leaving her in a cockpit, lit only by the glow of the stars through the viewport. She reached the center point. She pressed the transmit button. A single coded pulse left the drifter's communication antenna, the only system she had kept alive, and radiated outward in every direction at the speed of light. It passed through the Araeth formation like sunlight through glass. The warships did not detect it for 3 seconds because it was transmitted on a frequency they did not monitor, a frequency they had always considered too primitive to be worth their attention. 3 seconds was enough. The signal reached the first booster, and the second, and the third. One by one across the outer territories, 29 dormant machines woke up. Their solar panels, charged and ready, fed power to their signal processors. Their broadcast arrays came online, and they began to transmit. The contents of the Araeth data core, translated into English, formatted by Callum Webb into language that every human being could understand, went out across human space. Every colony, every station, every ship with a standard communication receiver. The truth, naked and undeniable, spoken in the Araeth's own words, and on the far edge of the network, in orbit around a dwarf star 3 days from the nearest living soul, The 30th booster received Marin's remote activation signal. The signal was weak, degraded, barely distinguishable from noise. The booster's receiver struggled with it for 1.4 seconds. Then it activated. Its solar panels unfolded. Its signal processor came online, and it broadcast, covering the gap in the network, reaching New Harmony and the 2 mining outposts, reaching the 12,000 people that Marin had refused to leave behind. 14% probability, Marin had chosen to believe. And the universe, for reasons that no one would ever be able to explain with mathematics, had chosen to agree. The Wraith warships converged on the drifter. They surrounded it, weapons charged, ready to deliver the final blow, but they did not fire. Because Commander Vasharath, watching from the bridge of his flagship, had realized what had just happened. He had seen the booster network come alive on his tactical display. He had listened to the first seconds of the broadcast, and he understood, with a clarity that cut through everything he thought he knew, that destroying Marin Okoro's ship would not stop what she had started. It was already done. The broadcast was already propagating through human space at the speed of light. It would reach the nearest colonies within hours, the farthest within days. And once it arrived, once human beings read the words that their supposed partners had written about them in private, there would be no taking it back. Vasharath stood on his bridge and felt something he had never felt before. It was the sensation of watching a plan, a careful, elegant, century-old plan built by the finest minds of the Concord, come apart, not with a battle, not with a weapon, not with anything the Wraith had prepared for, but with a signal broadcast from 30 ancient machines by a woman in a dying ship who had decided that the truth was worth more than her life. He gave the order to stand down. His crew obeyed, though some of them looked confused. Tessin, his second officer, asked why. Vasharath did not answer for a long time. He watched the drifter on his display, a broken ship drifting without power in the center of his formation, a dead ship to all appearances, destroyed in everything but name. He told Tessin to open a channel to the Concord High Command. He said the situation had changed. He said a report was needed. He said the word containment, and then he stopped, because the word no longer meant what it had meant an hour ago. And on the drifter, in a cockpit that was dark and cold and silent, Marin Okoro sat in her pilot's seat, wrapped in her 3 blankets, and breathed. The air was thin, the life support was failing. The ship was finished, but she was still alive, and the signal was still broadcasting. She leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she did not plan. She did not calculate. She did not listen for pursuers, or chart escape routes, or worry about what came next. She simply rested. Around her, the Wraith warships held their positions, weapons dark, watching. And across the vast distances of human space, the boosters sang. The broadcast reached the colony of New Thessaly first. It arrived in the middle of the local afternoon, when the docks were busy and the markets were full and people were going about the ordinary business of living in a place that they had built from nothing on the surface of a world that had not wanted them there. A dock worker named Priya heard it on her personal communicator while she was unloading cargo from a Venari freighter. She stopped working. She read the first few paragraphs. She read them again. Then she sat down on the crate she had been carrying and read the entire document, slowly, while the Venari captain shouted at her from the ship's ramp. On the mining station called Deepwell, a foreman named Gabriel was on his shift break when his communicator chimed with the incoming broadcast. He opened it, expecting routine station updates. He read for 10 minutes. Then he stood up, walked to the station's common area, and read the entire broadcast aloud to every person present, his voice steady and clear while the mining equipment hummed and ground in the tunnels below. On New Harmony, where the wheat grew in soil that humans had spent decades making fertile, a farmer named Io heard the broadcast on the community speaker system that was connected to the settlement's central receiver. She was standing in her field, hands in the dirt, when the words began. She listened. Around her, other farmers stopped working and listened too. When it was finished, no one spoke for a long time. Then Ao looked down at the soil beneath her fingernails, the soil her family had helped create, and she said one sentence. She said, "They did not give us this. We made this ourselves." The broadcast spread through human space the way fire spreads through dry grass, not in a single line but in every direction at once, jumping from person to person, station to station, colony to colony. Within 12 hours, every major human settlement had received it. Within 24 hours, it was the only thing anyone was talking about. The reaction was not what the Wraith had expected. They had prepared contingency plans for the possibility that their arrangement with humanity might be exposed. These plans assumed panic, disorganization, internal conflict. They assumed that humanity would turn on itself, arguing about what to do, fracturing into factions that the Concord could manipulate individually. They had models. They had projections. They had centuries of experience managing species that learned uncomfortable truths about their benefactors. Humanity did none of these things. What happened instead was something that the Wraith had never seen before, something that their models could not predict because it was rooted in a part of human nature that the Wraith had studied but never understood. Humanity got quiet. Not silent, quiet. The particular kind of quiet that descends on a room when everyone in it is thinking the same thing and knows that everyone else is thinking it too. The human governments, the ones that had signed the Wraith treaties, were the first to respond publicly. Most of them denied knowledge of the hidden clauses. Some were telling the truth. Others were not. It did not matter because the documents themselves were written in Wraith diplomatic script, authenticated with Wraith security codes, and bore the signatures of Wraith officials whose identities could be independently verified. The evidence was not ambiguous. It was not open to interpretation. It was a confession written by the hand that had committed the crime. Callum Webb, working from a location he refused to disclose, published a series of analyses that broke the documents down into categories: economic manipulation, political interference, military suppression, scientific censorship. Each category contained specific examples with dates, names, and amounts. He wrote in plain language, without editorializing, letting the facts speak for themselves. His analyses were shared millions of times within the first day of their publication. The Wraith Concord issued a formal statement on the second day. It was delivered by a senior diplomat named Orenthal, speaking from the Concord's embassy on the human world of Aldrin. Orenthal was tall and composed, and spoke with the measured cadence that humans had always found either soothing or condescending depending on their feelings about the Wraith. He acknowledged that the documents were authentic. He expressed regret that they had become public in this manner. He emphasized that the Concord's relationship with humanity had always been guided by a desire for mutual prosperity and stability. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge wrongdoing. He spoke as if the revelation were an inconvenience rather than an injustice, as if the appropriate response was to discuss the matter calmly and reach a new understanding that would benefit both species. The human audiences who watched his statement understood exactly what they were hearing. They had heard it before, in different languages, from different mouths, throughout their long history. It was the sound of power explaining to the powerless why their suffering was necessary. It was the sound of a hand adjusting the bars of a cage while telling the prisoner that the cage was actually a home. This time they were not willing to accept it. The changes did not happen overnight. They did not happen with violence, which surprised the Wraith and surprised many humans as well. They happened with the slow, grinding force of a species that had decided collectively to stop cooperating with its own containment. Colony governments began reviewing their trade agreements. Economic advisors, armed with the specific details from the data core, identified the hidden clauses and published them alongside their public counterparts, showing exactly where the manipulation lay. Within a week, 7 human colonies had formally suspended their trade agreements with the Wraith Concord, pending renegotiation of terms. The Wraith protested. They threatened economic consequences. They pointed out correctly that human colonies depended on Wraith markets for goods and services that they could not produce themselves. They were right. The dependence was real. It had been engineered over a century, and it could not be undone in a week. But humans had dealt with dependence before. They had a word for the process of undoing it. The word was weaning. And they were very, very good at it. Engineers on human stations began examining the technology the Wraith had provided. They found what Devi Krishnamurthy had found years ago on New Thessaly: monitoring equipment, hidden in communication satellites and power systems and navigation arrays, designed to feed information to the Concord. They removed it. They catalogued it. They published their findings. Each discovery added weight to the evidence that the data core had provided. Scientists who had been quietly frustrated by restrictions on their research began publishing work that had previously been suppressed. Developments in propulsion, advances in energy generation, new approaches to terraforming that the Wraith had discouraged because they would make human colonies self-sufficient. The human scientific community, freed from invisible constraints it had not fully recognized, experienced a surge of activity that one historian would later describe as a second renaissance. And across the outer territories, the old signal boosters continued to broadcast. Marin had programmed them to repeat the data core's contents on a continuous loop. The Araeth could not shut them down without physically visiting each one, and the boosters were scattered across such a wide area that doing so would take months. In the meantime, every human ship and every human station that pointed a receiver in the right direction could hear the truth playing on repeat, steady and calm, like a heartbeat. Marin heard none of this. When the Araeth warships had surrounded the drifter, her communication system had been the last thing still functioning, and it had died shortly after transmitting the activation signal. She was adrift in a dead ship, with failing life support and no way to contact anyone. Vasharath could have left her there. His orders technically were to eliminate the threat. The woman was the threat. The woman in the dead ship drifting in the void, with air that was running out and heat that was already gone. He did not leave her there. He sent a shuttle. 2 Araeth officers in environmental suits crossed from the shuttle to the drifter's airlock and found Marin in the cockpit, wrapped in 3 blankets, unconscious from the cold and the thin air. They brought her to the shuttle. They gave her oxygen. They warmed her, and they brought her to Vasharath's ship, the Whisper of Dawn, where she was placed in a holding cell that was, by the standards of Araeth incarceration, comfortable and warm, and supplied with more food than Marin had eaten in weeks. When she woke, Vasharath was standing outside her cell. He was tall, even for an Araeth, with silver eyes that reflected the light in a way that made them look like they contained small stars. His face was angular and still, the face of someone who had learned to control every expression. He did not speak for a long time. He stood and looked at her, and she looked back at him, sitting on the cell's narrow bed with her blankets still wrapped around her shoulders because the Araeth had allowed her to keep them. When he finally spoke, he asked her a question. He asked her if she understood what she had done. Marin considered the question. She said yes. He asked her if she understood the consequences, the economic disruption, the diplomatic crisis, the potential for conflict between the Concord and humanity, conflict that could cost lives on both sides. Marin said she understood. He asked her why she had done it. And Marin, who had always been good at listening, but who had never been particularly good at speeches, said something simple. She said that the truth was not a weapon. She said it was not a tool or a strategy or a move in a game. She said that the truth was the ground you stood on. She said that if someone took the ground from under you without telling you, if they replaced it with something that looked like ground but was actually a trap, then giving it back was not an act of war. It was an act of respect. Vasharath was quiet for a very long time after she said this. Then he told her something that she had not expected. He told her that the Concord High Command had been in contact with him for the past 12 hours. He told her that the situation had been assessed at the highest levels. He told her that there were voices within the Concord calling for severe measures against humanity, a full economic blockade, military posturing, perhaps even direct intervention. But there were other voices too, younger voices. Aerith, who had studied human history not as a threat assessment, but as a subject worthy of genuine understanding. Aerith, who had read the broadcast and felt something that their culture did not have a ready word for, but that humans called shame. The debate within the Concord was fierce. It was not resolved. It might not be resolved for years, but the fact that it was happening at all, the fact that Aerith were questioning the Concord's treatment of humanity for the first time in a century, was a crack in a wall that had seemed unbreakable. Vasharath told Marin that she was being released, not as an act of mercy, as a diplomatic decision. The Concord could not afford, in the current climate, to be seen punishing the woman who had revealed their secrets. It would confirm everything the broadcast had said. It would turn her into a symbol that humanity would rally around for generations. He told her that a transport would take her to the nearest neutral station. He told her that the drifter was being towed to the same station, though he warned her that the ship was damaged beyond any reasonable expectation of repair. Marin said she would fix it. She said this with a certainty that made Vasharath's eyes narrow slightly, because the ship was, by any objective measure, destroyed. Vasharath told her that Jonas Patel had been released by the warships that had intercepted him. He was unharmed. He was already, according to the latest reports, heading back to his fuel depot, where he had reportedly told every passing ship about what had happened, in considerable detail, for anyone who would listen. She asked about Rin and the Lindgrens. Vasharath said they had disappeared into the outer territories, His ships had not pursued them. He said this with a tone that might have been frustration, or might have been something closer to admiration. Marin stood up from the bed. She folded her blankets over her arm. She looked at Vasharath, this tall, silver-eyed commander who had been ordered to hunt her and who was now opening her cell door. She said something to him that he would remember for the rest of his very long life. She said that she did not blame him. She said that he had been doing what his people had taught him to do, the same way that humanity had been doing what the Araeth had taught them to do. She said the difference was that humans had a talent for unlearning, for tearing down the thing they had been taught and building something new in its place. She said she hoped the Araeth could learn to do the same. Then she walked out of the cell, down the corridor of the most advanced warship in the Araeth fleet, past crew members who watched her with their silver eyes and said nothing, through the airlock and onto the transport that was waiting to take her home. The transport brought her to Station Mira, a neutral trading post in the space between Cathari and Venari territory. The drifter was already there, docked in a repair berth, looking like something that had been chewed up and spit out by the universe. The hull was torn. The engine was silent. The cargo hold was open to space. Marin stood on the observation deck and looked at her ship for a long time. Then she went to work. Word had spread. By the time Marin reached Station Mira, the story of what she had done was known across the outer territories. Traders, mechanics, engineers, and ordinary people who had heard the broadcast and understood what it meant began arriving at the station. They came with tools. They came with parts. They came with skills and time, and the simple desire to help. Devi Krishnamurthy arrived 3 days later, carrying a bag of equipment and wearing her enormous glasses. She walked into the repair berth, looked at the drifter, took off her glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, and said 7 words. She said, "We are going to need more cable." The repair took 3 weeks. 37 people worked on it, humans from 12 different colonies, speaking 7 different languages, sleeping in shifts in the station's common areas, and eating food that the station's vendors provided for free because Marin's name was known now, and no one on Station Mira wanted to be the person who charged her for a meal. They rebuilt the drifter, not just repaired it. Rebuilt it. They kept the hull because Marin asked them to, scarred and patched and ugly as it was. They replaced the engine with a newer model donated by a colony called Brasilia Nova. They upgraded the navigation computer with Devi's latest design. They sealed the cargo hold with armor plating that a Kothari trader had given them, saying only that Marin had always been kind about the dried fruit. The heating system worked on both sides of the ship for the first time in 20 years. When it was finished, Marin sat in the pilot's seat and ran her hands over the controls. The cockpit was the same. The seat was the same. The viewport showed the same stars. But everything else had changed, and Marin knew that she had changed too, in ways she was still discovering. She flew the drifter out of Station Mira on a morning that had no meaning in space but that the station's residents had decided to treat as significant. People gathered on the observation deck to watch her leave. Some of them waved. Some of them stood in silence. A few cried, though they would deny it later. Marin flew the drifter to New Thessaly. She delivered the medical supplies she had been carrying when this began. Not the original supplies, which were scattered across the void where the Araeth beam had torn open her cargo hold. New supplies, donated by 6 different colonies, loaded into the drifter's rebuilt hold by hands that belonged to people who would never meet the colonists of New Thessaly, but who wanted them to know that someone cared. She delivered medicine to Deepwell. She delivered seed stock to New Harmony, where the farmer named Ao was standing in her field, waiting for her, because someone had told her the story of how Marin had refused to leave 12,000 people out of the broadcast, and she had wanted to say thank you in person. And then Marin did something that no one expected, and that everyone, once they heard about it, understood. She flew to the place between the 2 dying stars, the place where the old navigation charts drew warnings and the new ones drew nothing at all, a stretch of empty space so deep and dark that light itself seemed exhausted by the time it passed through. She took a small device from her pocket. It was a beacon, no bigger than a clenched fist, built by Devi from materials that would last 1,000 years. She programmed it with a single recording, not the data core, not a message, not a speech, or a warning, or a declaration of victory. A heartbeat, her heartbeat, recorded with a medical sensor from the drifter's tiny first aid kit. Steady, calm. The sound of a human being alive. She launched the beacon into the void. It tumbled away from the drifter, small and bright against the darkness, and began its endless orbit between the dying stars. Its signal went out on every known frequency, and several that were not known, a single heartbeat playing over and over into the emptiness. It was not a monument. Monuments were built by the powerful to remind others of their power. It was not a memorial. Memorials marked endings, and this was not an end. It was a pulse, a steady, rhythmic pulse that said simply and without elaboration, I am here. We are here. We have always been here, and we are not going anywhere. Marin watched the beacon until it was too small to see. Then she turned the drifter toward the open stars and flew. The years that followed were complicated in the way that all periods of change are complicated. The Uraeus Concord did not collapse. It did not retreat from human space, but it could no longer operate as it had. The treaties were renegotiated, this time in public, with human negotiators who had read every hidden clause and knew exactly what to demand. The economic controls were dismantled, not quickly, not without resistance, but steadily, as human colonies discovered that the self-sufficiency they had been told was impossible was merely difficult, and difficult was something humans had never been afraid of. The old signal boosters continued to broadcast for another year before Marin sent the shutdown command. By then, their job was done. The truth was part of the public record, taught in schools, discussed in councils, referenced in every negotiation between humanity and the Concord. The boosters went dark, one by one, returning to the dormancy they had known for 50 years. But they were not forgotten this time. Human engineers visited them, serviced them, maintained them. Just in case, Jonas Patel became something of a legend at his fuel depot. Every passing ship heard the story, whether they wanted to or not. He told it the same way every time, with the same rough laugh and the same anger and the same pride. He died 8 years later, in his sleep at his depot, with rock and roll playing on the speakers. He was given a funeral that drew ships from 11 colonies. Rin Takahashi returned to her daughter's colony and watched it grow. The economic restrictions that had been strangling it were lifted. New trade routes opened. The colony prospered. Rin flew the Bright Needle for another 15 years before retiring to a house her daughter built for her, with a view of the mountains and a garden where she grew flowers she had never had time to plant. The Lindgrens continued their salvage work. They never spoke publicly about their involvement in the broadcast. They did not need to. People who needed to know already knew, and the Lindgrens had never been interested in recognition. They were interested in work, and the outer territories provided plenty of it. Devi Krishnamurthy finished her universal interface. The final version could connect to the technology of every known species in the galaxy. She published the designs for free, refusing every offer of payment or partnership because she believed that communication should not have a price tag. Her design became the standard for cross-species technology interaction. She lived in her workshop at the Knot until she was very old, surrounded by cables and circuit boards and the smell of solder, still building, still creating, still making things that connected people. Callum Webb published a book. It was called The Invisible Cage, and it became the most widely read work of non-fiction in human history. He donated the proceeds to a fund that supported independent journalism in the Outer Territories. He never revealed where he had been when he wrote his analyses of the broadcast. Some people said he had been at the Knot. Others said he had been on a ship, flying alone through the territories, writing as he moved. He never confirmed or denied any theory. He said that the story was not about him, and he meant it. And Marin Okoro flew. She returned to the back routes, the forgotten paths between stars, carrying cargo to the colonies that needed it. Medicine, water purification tablets, seed stock, replacement parts. The same work she had always done, in the same battered ship she had always flown, on routes that were no longer hidden because there was no longer anything to hide from. She did not become a political figure. She did not give speeches or write books or appear on broadcasts. When people asked her about what she had done, she said that she was a trader who had found something important and had made sure it got to the people who needed it. She said this was what traders did. The galaxy changed around her, not because of one woman or one broadcast or one data core, but because a species that had been contained, that had been managed and manipulated and diminished, had been given the truth and had decided to do something with it. The changes were messy and imperfect and slow, the way all human progress is messy and imperfect and slow. But they were real, and in the space between two dying stars, a small beacon tumbled through the void. It broadcast on every frequency, a single heartbeat, steady and calm, to anyone who cared to listen. Some species heard it and thought it was a warning. Stay away. This is what happens when you hunt us. Others heard it and thought it was a claim. This space is ours. But the humans who heard it, the ones who knew the story, understood that it was neither of these things. It was not a warning, and it was not a claim. It was a statement, made without anger or pride or fear, broadcast into the endless dark by a woman who had spent her life listening to a universe that was constantly trying to tell her something. The statement was simple. We are still here, and the beacon played on, and on, and on. In the silence between the dying stars, where nothing else moved and nothing else sang, a human heartbeat circled the void, patient, steady, unending. As if to say that some things, once started, do not stop. As if to say that a species capable of building a cage is not nearly as remarkable as a species capable of tearing one down. As if to say that the most dangerous thing in the universe is not a weapon or a fleet or an empire, but a single ordinary person who has decided that the truth matters more than their own survival. The beacon broadcast. The stars burned. The void was silent except for the sound of a heart beating. Somewhere, on a ship called the Drifter, Mariner Coro flew toward the next colony on her list, carrying medicine and seeds and the quiet certainty that she had done the one thing that mattered. She had made sure the ground was real. Everything else, humanity would build for itself.